Yeah, thanks again for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm really happy to be here. I'm, as Colin introduced me, I'm Amy, and I'm the Motus Coordinator for Birds Canada in the BC region. Um, and so Modus is a international collaborative endeavor to track the movements of small flying animals, mostly birds, but there's also been projects studying bats as well, and even a few on large insects like monarchs and darners. Modus is Latin for movement, and the Motus Wildlife Tracking System is one of Birds Canada's programs in partnership with Acadia University in Nova Scotia and with the support and collaboration of many, many other partners. So I'm grateful to be here with you virtually tonight in Vancouver on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I'm going to start my talk by introducing you to Modus broadly as a system, and then I'll talk more specifically about Birds Canada's new project studying Dunlin movements around the Fraser River Estuary. So the conservation of migratory species is very challenging because it requires considering threats that occur at different stages of their life cycle that typically span multiple jurisdictions, habitats, and different landscapes that are often thousands of kilometers apart. So in order to enact effective conservation, for migratory birds, we have to first figure out where bottlenecks are occurring, unlock where populations might be limited, and then prioritize where and what conservation actions might have the greatest impact. So kind of the ultimate goal of migratory animal research, or the holy grail, is to basically know where all animals are all the time, which is really hard. But I'll give you an example of why studying migratory animals can be challenging and the importance of examining the full annual cycle of migratory animals, and that's the red knot. And they experienced large declines in the late 1990s and the early 2000s due to overharvesting of horseshoe crabs in Delaware Bay. And that's because red knots feed voraciously on horseshoe crab eggs during northbound migration when they stop over in Delaware Bay. And because of this overharvesting, they couldn't gain enough fat for migration to build up the fat that they needed to migrate to the Arctic breeding grounds. So the population declined a lot. And the horseshoe crab fishery is more strictly regulated now, but red knot populations have somewhat stabilized, but they haven't really recovered. So what's preventing this recovery, and where and when in the annual cycle? Is it still happening on northbound migration through Delaware Bay, or is it occurring at some other part of the annual cycle? So understanding this full annual cycle of species and how all the seasons and the places are linked together is really important for effective conservation. So tracking technologies are one tool that can give us a lot of insight into an animal's life cycle. And the important thing to remember about tracking technologies is that they're complementary. There are many different types of tracking technologies, and there's not really a one-size-fits-all solution. It really depends on what your research question is, which ones you might choose to use. So I've got a few examples. There are geolocators, like on this blackpoll warbler, and geolocators will give you a full year of data and determine a rough location of a bird based on the day length. But the challenging thing about them is that they have to be recaptured to get the data. So you have to catch the bird again, which is very difficult. Then we have traditional bird banding, which is inexpensive and it's not very invasive. So that's really great, but the recapture rate is pretty low. I think it's less than 1% for a lot of non-game birds. So you get limited information back from recaptures because it's so rare to recapture birds. Leg flags have a higher recapture rate because you don't have to physically recapture the bird. You just have to see it and be able to read the leg flag. So you get a bit more information, but still not as much data as you might get from some of the tagging tracking technologies like GPS tags, which are very precise, but they record a limited number of points. And some of the smaller ones, you also need to recapture those birds to get the data back. Satellite tags, like on this Jaeger, are great, but the technology hasn't developed enough for them to be light enough for smaller birds. And then we have radio telemetry tags, which are smaller, so you can put them on smaller birds, but the bird has to pass close by a receiver in order to get detected. So how many detections you get depends on what your receiver coverage is like. So the Motus Wildlife Tracking System, as I mentioned, it's an international collaborative research network, and it uses coordinated automated radio telemetry to facilitate research and education on conservation and the ecology of migratory animals. And radio telemetry as a technology has been around for quite a while, and it's been used to track animals since the 1960s. And the fundamental concepts haven't changed a lot, but the technology has developed since then. And essentially how it works is you've got a transmitter that emits a signal at a specific frequency, and then that signal is picked up by an antenna that's connected to a receiver monitoring at that frequency. And the receivers can be in fixed locations or they can be mobile. Like this photo here is of a receiver in a car. It's presumably got the antenna on the roof. And then, so that will pick up the tags in the area. And traditionally, each transmitter would operate at a different frequency so that they could be individually identified by those frequencies. And the receiver would cycle through that set of frequencies, monitoring for each different tag. But Modus, as a tracking system, is radio telemetry with a twist. So the philosophy behind Modus is to harness the collective power of many individual research projects into one big coordinated effort so that we can expand the scale and the impact of everyone's work while also maximizing the limited funding that's available for research. So essentially, we should all be working together. And instead of having transmitters each on different frequencies, transmitters in the Modus system are all in the same frequency, but they're still individually identifiable because they have a digitally encoded ID. So this way, all receiver stations in the network are continuously monitoring for all transmitters in the network. And this is kind of the key to what makes Modus tick, is that if I tag some birds, but then they move out of the area I'm in, but pass by a receiver that someone else is using and has set up, even if they are not connected to my project at all, their receivers can still pick up any birds that I tag, because all of the receivers in the network are monitoring for tags at that frequency. So the system should grow and develop cooperatively so that everyone can benefit. And most importantly, we can all work collaboratively on our research so that it benefits conservation efforts as much as possible. So while researchers can still work on their own projects using Modus, these projects can also be leveraged collectively to gain more knowledge about the threats that migratory animals are facing. So what are the advantages of radio telemetry compared to other tracking technologies? Some of radio transmitters are some of the smallest available tracking devices. They can weigh as little as under 0.2 grams. So you can put them on fairly small animals, those that are too small to carry things like satellite tags. And the tags can be either battery or solar powered. They also have very high temporal precision. So when a bird is detected, you know it was there down to the second. And this can be really great for when you're studying things like departure timing on migration. When do birds leave a stopover site and under what weather conditions? That sort of thing. And you also don't need to recapture the bird to get the data back. The detections are stored on the receiver, not the transmitter. Modus is radio telemetry, but it's also collaborative and automated. And so automated means that the receivers are continuously monitoring for transmitters. It's not only when you go out with a handheld antenna and scan for animals in your area. The receivers are operating continuously, so they're listening for all tags all the time, independent of whether you're there or not. And it's collaborative in that many different people are working on it, but Birds Canada houses all of the data for any projects that are part of the network, so that all the data is integrated into the Modus database, which facilitates collaboration among the people using Modus. And it also means that we can make visualizations of the data available to the public on the Modus website as well. So I'll take you through a bit of a closer look at some of the key components of the system and what makes it work. And that's the animals that get tagged with radio transmitters and the receivers that detect them. So as I mentioned, the radio transmitters can be either solar or battery powered. The battery powered tags have gotten down really small as the technology develops, so they can be under 0.2 grams, like these ones here, but because they have, they're so light, they have a very small battery, so the battery life is limited. So a larger tag with a bigger battery will last longer. So if you are tagging larger birds that can carry a little bit more weight, you might choose to have a slightly heavier tag to maximize the life of the battery. The solar tags are quite new. One type doesn't have a battery at all, so it's quite light. It's under 0.5 gram, and that's this type of solar tag here. But it will only transmit at night because it has to be receiving sunlight. Or sorry, it won't transmit at night. It will only transmit during the day because it doesn't have a battery. So it depends on what you're trying to study, whether you want to be able to detect movements at night as well as during the day. There's another type of solar tag that has an onboard battery that these little solar cells can recharge. So in theory, it could last indefinitely, but it is heavier because it has that battery. So it's about 1.5 grams. So only the larger birds can really carry that. And this is a red knot that's just been tagged, and you can see the little antenna from the transmitter kind of extending out over the back and tail. And then there are the receiver stations that detect the tagged animals, and you can see that they come in all sorts of forms in all kinds of places and habitats. We've got a mini station here in the Montana hills, or there's ones where they're attached to fire towers or buildings in Pennsylvania. We have a pop-up tower in New Brunswick, to an office building roof in downtown Ottawa. So they can be in all kinds of places, and with the right tools and a little creativity, you can figure out how to set up a Modus station just about anywhere. And most researchers will set up their own station, as these folks did, using a tree trunk to attach their antennas to at the top of a mountain in the Colombian Andes. So for some of the trickier installations, we might recruit a bit of help, such as using a bucket truck to get the antennas up on the roof at this station, up in the top right corner. But basically what you need is some antennas that you can elevate and then fasten securely to a mast or a structure, and then connect those antennas via cables down to the computer part of the Modus station receiver. And there are two different types of receiver computers. We've got the sensor station and the sensor gnome, and they work similarly. They just have different makers. They can be connected to the internet or the cell network to transfer data back to the Modus database automatically. If you don't have internet or cell coverage, you can do manual data downloads, so that works just fine as well. They're also open source software, so if someone's technically inclined, they could work on building their own too. And they can be powered by solar as well, or standard power supply. So this one on the left is at a wetland viewing platform, and it's got a solar panel powering it. But they can also be plugged into just your regular outlet if you've got one attached to a building. They have generally, under ideal conditions, they can detect a bird up to 15 or 20 kilometers away. It helps if you've got a clear line of sight and you can get the antennas up high, like this great view in Montana of this station here. So this is a map of all of the receiver stations. Each yellow dot is a Modus station. So it's really an international network at this point, and it's growing all the time. We just passed, I think, 1,000 stations a week or two ago. Nice. And they're mostly in Eastern North America, where the Motus Wildlife Tracking System started, but it's growing all the time in South America, in Europe, Australia, and here in Western North America as well. So what you have when you put all these tagged animals together with the array of receivers is you get data that reveals animal movement across the landscape. And I just pulled this example of semi-palmated sandpipers and white-rumped sandpipers that were tagged in James Bay during southbound migration. And it shows how they moved from James Bay out to the east coast of Canada and the United States. And the semi-palmated sandpipers in green, a lot of them moved into the Bay of Fundy, which is a major stopover site for semi-palmated sandpipers, whereas a lot of the white rumps moved a little further south along the coast as they migrated south. But it's not quite as simple as transmitters plus receivers. An international collaborative network requires a lot of infrastructure support and behind the scenes maintenance to keep it all running. So this is kind of how it all fits together. You've got the animals with their tracking devices, and then they're picked up by these receiving stations that researchers set up. And then all that data goes back to the centralized Modus database that Birds Canada hosts. And then from there, researchers can go in and get the data on the animals they tagged. And also that data gets summarized into outputs on the Modus website for the public. And hopefully these data lead to conservation science and action, as well as public engagement and education about animal migration and conservation. So I just got this a couple days ago to see where we're at this week. We've got 31 countries on 4 continents have Modus stations, and we just passed 1,000 stations, as I mentioned, and we need to expand our bubble there since we've gotten to 4 digits. We have over 25,000 animals have been tagged and tracked using Modus of over 200 different species. And so far, about just over 100 publications have come from these data. So I wanted to just highlight what a Modus research project can yield and what kind of studies you can do with Modus. And so I wanted to highlight this really excellent example of research done on thrushes on northbound migration that was led by Dr. Camila Gomez, who's a researcher with the Colombian NGO Selva. And Dr. Gomez and her team studied gray-cheeked thrushes migrating north from a stopover site in northern Colombia and found that they were making flights of up to 3,000 kilometers from this stopover site. And they also found that the birds that were able to put on more fat at the stopover site were able to fly faster and arrive more quickly in North America. So in this little figure on the right here, along the x-axis on the bottom, we have the departure fuel load, which is essentially how much fat the bird is putting on before they leave from this stopover site to head north. And then on the y-axis, you've got the days between when they left South America and when they were next detected on a Modus station in North America. And so birds that left Colombia without much fat took many days before they were detected in North America, whereas birds that left Colombia with a lot of fat migrated very quickly and were detected only a few days later in North America. So work like this shows how important this stopover site is in Colombia for these birds, and how protecting habitat like this is essential for conservation. Okay, so now I'll switch gears and talk about our work tracking Dunlin in the Fraser River Estuary, now that we have kind of a general overview of how Modus works. So this project is really just in its early stages. So what I have to show you is much less polished than that thrush example, and is preliminary results at the moment. But I think it's really interesting and a neat project. I'll be the first to say that I have a lot to learn about this ecosystem. I only moved to BC a little less than a year ago, after working with shorebirds out east mostly. So it's been really exciting to learn about the West Coast and study shorebirds out here as well. I imagine a number of you may be familiar with this and have seen this study that came out a year or two ago that showed there are nearly 3 billion fewer birds in North America than there were 50 years ago. And these losses aren't just endangered or threatened species, but also large declines of even common species. And lots of factors contribute to this, but habitat loss and degradation is a major one. If we look specifically at Canada and break this down into groups of birds, some of the groups like waterfowl and raptors have increased, but shorebirds and also grassland birds and aerial insectivores like swallows have declined a lot. Shorebirds overall have declined by 40% in Canada since 1970. And if we break that down further into long and short distance migrants, the long distance migrants are faring particularly poorly and have declined by over 50% since 1970. Many of them are listed as species of conservation concern. Many shorebirds are long-distance migrants that breed in the Arctic and winter as far away as South America, and these long migrations use a lot of energy. So many shorebirds will rely on a limited number of key stopover sites where they can rest and refuel and build up the fat reserves that they need to make their next long flight. So they'll fly a long distance, sometimes thousands of kilometers nonstop, and then they'll stop for a few days to a few weeks in a particular region and feed intensively to build up fat to power their next long flight. So shorebirds need these stopover sites that can provide adequate food resources and habitat where they can feed and rest. And without high quality sites, things like survival, breeding may be affected. If they fail to build up enough fat during stopover, they may die during migration or arrive on the breeding grounds without the energy reserves that they need to be able to breed and raise chicks. So it's important that we protect stopover sites so shorebirds can continue to rely on them to complete their migrations. And you can think about it kind of like a giant hemispheric ladder where you've got a certain number of rungs, and if you lose enough of those rungs, you won't be able to climb the ladder anymore. And as I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone here, the Fraser River Estuary is a very important stopover site for over 1 million shorebirds every year. And they come to the expansive intertidal mudflats here to feed on invertebrates like worms and small crustaceans, as well as energy-rich biofilm. to build up those fat reserves for the next leg of their migration. And the biofilm is essentially single-celled algae and a gelatinous carbohydrate that binds it all together into a film that covers the mudflat surface. And the Western sandpipers in particular will skim along that surface and scoop up the biofilm. The Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network recognizes the Fraser Estuary as a site of hemispheric level importance for shorebirds, and it's also an important bird area. Some studies say that up to 60% of the world's population of Western sandpipers stop here during their 10,000 kilometer migration, and I'm sure many of us have seen the huge flocks of them during migration. It's really quite spectacular. Dunlin also migrate through the Fraser Estuary as they travel to and from their breeding grounds in the Arctic, and thousands of them also spend the winter here. So our objective at Birds Canada was to start a new project studying the movement patterns of Dunlin in the Fraser River Estuary, both during stopover during the migratory period and during the winter. It's an urbanized area with more development possible in the future, so it's important to know how Dunlin move around and use the area. And we wanted to use Modus technology to build on previous research done as PhD research by Pippa Shepherd about 20 years ago, to build on her work with the new technology available through Modus, and look at how Dunlin are using the area to inform site and regional level conservation needs. So we were hypothesizing that Dunlin might move more locally than regionally. So Dunlin in Boundary Bay might largely stay in Boundary Bay, and Dunlin out on Roberts Bank or Sturgeon Bank might largely stay around there. And there might not be so much crossover between the areas, but we weren't really sure. So we wanted to look at the tag them and use Modus to track their movements. When we started this project earlier in 2020, there were already 3 Modus stations in the area set up along the coast by Environment Canada, and for their research, including some research they were doing on Western sandpipers. And this is one of the benefits of Modus. These stations that were already here would help our research by detecting Dunlin as well. And any new stations we set up would help Environment Canada's ongoing research on Western sandpiper. So there were already stations at near Brunswick Point, at Alaxon, and at Iona, but there weren't any in Boundary Bay, which was one of our areas of interest. So we have set up a couple of new stations since August. Environment Canada set up another one in partnership with Tsawwassen First Nation in Tsawwassen, and then Birds Canada, we set up a couple new ones along the Boundary Bay Dike Trail in partnership with Metro Vancouver Parks, and also with the City of Surrey at Blackie Spit. So this is the station at Blackie Spit overlooking Mud Bay. The City of Surrey was a super helpful partner. They really helped us out a lot by working with us to mount the antennas on their pump station, and they brought in their bucket truck to help us get them up there on the roof. Nice. So this station, since it's up on a building, it's really sturdy, and we're hoping that it'll be a long-term station that will be there and running for the foreseeable future. It's got a great clear view out over the water, so we've been picking up lots of detections on it, not only Dunlin, but also Western sandpipers and some Swainson's thrush detections as well. So we've been really happy with this new station. It's been working really well. This is the station that we installed along in a field just behind the Boundary Bay Dike Trail. So this one, Metro Vancouver Parks helped us with access to the field, and it's a pop-up tower style station secured with these guy lines. And it's also powered by a solar panel. We're working on finding some nearby infrastructure to move the station to a more permanent location, but in the meantime, it's been working great. We've detected a lot of Dunlin on it, so I've been really happy with that one as well. There are still a couple of gaps that we'd like to fill in, so we're hoping to get a couple more stations up in the next year or so. I'm working with the city of Delta to hopefully install a station on the Boundary Bay side of Tsawwassen, and then we're also hoping to get a station up along Sturgeon Bank too. So with the stations up and running, we needed to tag the Dunlin, and so we could start tracking them. So we wanted to tag birds both during migration and make sure we also tagged birds that were overwintering in the Fraser Estuary. So we did 2 rounds of captures, one in October and then a second one in December. We also tagged birds at 2 locations, one in Boundary Bay and one between Roberts Bank and Brunswick Point in that area. We caught the birds using mist nets, really fine mesh nets, and we worked at night because shorebirds have very sharp vision and they would see and avoid the nets during the day. We were constantly monitoring the nets, so as soon as a bird landed in a net, we would take them out immediately, so they were captured and handled for as little time as possible. And we took a suite of body measurements like wing and bill and checking how much fat they had stored. And then we added the tags to track them with Modus, and as well as a uniquely coded leg flag. So the tags, we glued the little radio transmitters on the lower back on some feather stubble. And you can see, I circled it there, the little antenna extending out over the tail and behind the bird. The tags weigh less than a gram, so that's less than 2% of Dunlin's body weight, and gluing them on the lower back aligns the tag with the bird's center of gravity to minimize any effects on the bird. Also, the tag will eventually fall off since it's glued on, often when the bird next molts, so that then the bird is not carrying a tag that's no longer transmitting once the battery on the tag has died. We also used leg flags, which are fairly common for shorebirds. They have a unique code and can be recited by birders and surveyors with a scope, and they'll last longer than the tags, so you could see them again in subsequent years. The recites, well, we don't get as many as we would get with detections of Modus tags. When we do get recites, these can also tell us about where the birds traveled, and with enough recites, you can start to do analyses to estimate survival rates and that sort of thing. A neat thing about leg flags on shorebirds is that the color of the flag can tell you what country the bird was banded in. So shorebirds banded in Canada will get a white flag, and shorebirds banded in the US will get a green flag. Orange is Argentina, blue is Brazil. So that's just kind of a neat thing. If you see a colored flag, you can find out what country the bird was banded in. They're hard to spot with only a few flagged Dunlin out there, but if you do see any, let me know. I'd love to hear about it. And now on to a few preliminary results. So the Dunlin are still out there moving around the Fraser Estuary, so data is coming in all the time. Get a few more detections most days, which is really exciting. But I downloaded all the available data earlier this week to start looking at movement patterns. And so on the left here in green, we've got Dunlin that were tagged in Boundary Bay, and then on the right in purple, got Dunlin that were tagged on Roberts Bank. And the size of each point represents the number of Dunlin detections at that particular Modus station. So what we can see is that birds appear to be moving between Boundary Bay and Roberts Bank or Sturgeon Bank. So the birds that were tagged in Boundary Bay are not just staying in Boundary Bay, they're also being detected up at Iona and down at Brunswick Point and Tsawwassen as well. Same with Roberts Bank, birds tagged there are also getting detected in Boundary Bay. But the distribution isn't quite even. So birds that were tagged in Boundary Bay do have more detections in Boundary Bay at stations like Blackie Spit than birds that were tagged at Roberts Bank. Not as many of them have been detected at Blackie Spit, and the same vice versa. Lots of birds detected at Roberts Bank that were tagged there. Not quite as many birds detected at Roberts Bank that were tagged in Boundary Bay. Don't worry about all of these, but I just wanted to pull out what it looks like for individual birds. So each of these is an individual bird, and we can see that some of them did stay just in Boundary Bay, that were tagged in Boundary Bay. And then some that were tagged at Roberts Bank did just stay at Roberts Bank, but also lots of them moved around quite a bit between stations. So the detection patterns revealed by these data vary a lot among the individual Dunlin. The number of days that an individual bird was detected varied from just 1 day to 77 days where a bird was detected, which is pretty good considering that that particular bird was only tagged 92 days ago. So that's being detected almost every day since we tagged it. Some birds were detected only on one Modus station, while others were detected on up to 5 different Modus stations. And that's not to say that a bird that was only detected at one station was only detected there briefly. We had one bird that was detected at Blackie Spit, and only Blackie Spit, but it was detected there almost continuously for over a month. So it appeared to stay mostly in that part of the bay. We also had one bird that we tagged in Boundary Bay that popped out to Abbotsford. Though it might not have gone quite that far inland, the stations under ideal conditions do have a 10 to 20 kilometer range, so it might not have gone quite that far, but that was an interesting movement. And I thought I'd show you a couple plots of the raw detection data just to demonstrate these differences in detection patterns. So on the y-axis, we have the strength of the signal that the Modus station receives from the tag. And then along the bottom here, we've got date and time. So this is just over the course of a little more than 10 minutes, but this is the detection from Abbotsford. So what you can see is there's a curve in this detection pattern, in the strength of the signal varies. So generally this kind of curve is characteristic of a bird flying by the station, not stopping at it. So you can get a little bit of information about behavior, which is kind of neat. This signal starts out weaker as the bird just enters the detection range of the antenna, and then it gets stronger as the bird flies closer to the center of the detection range, and then it weakens again as the bird flies away and moves out of the detection range. So that's so it seems like the bird didn't stop in Abbotsford. It just passed by in flight. So that's kind of an interesting thing you can see in the detection data to see if when a bird was passing by a tower rather than stopping. And then this particular bird was only detected very briefly for less than an hour, a couple of little blips at Blackie Spit. But conversely, we have something like this where a bird was detected at 5 different stations and consistently for over a month from early December to early January. And it spent a lot of time and got detected a lot at Brunswick Point, but it also popped around to a few other stations as well. When I'm going through Modus data, I usually make a rough map of the detections for each bird individually to get a sense of what's happening. And I wanted to share this one because I saw something cool when I looked at it. So each point on this very rough map is a detection and is colored by the month of when the detection occurred. And the little red asterisk is where the bird was tagged. So this bird was tagged in late October. And then it was detected consistently in the Fraser Estuary until early December, and then it wasn't detected at all anymore for 2 months, until just this past weekend. It was picked up again in the Fraser after 2 months of not being detected at all. So it looks like this bird left the Fraser for a couple months over the winter, and now it's come back. So that was a neat find when I was just looking through the data to see that a bird that had disappeared a couple of months ago had come back. So the next steps for this Dunlin project, we're still in the early stages, so lots more work to do and lots more to figure out. As I mentioned, we're hoping to get those 2 more stations up to fill a couple gaps on the Boundary Bay side of Tsawwassen and up on Sturgeon Bank. And then we're also thinking about doing a little pilot test round of tagging this spring to get a few more tags out on Dunlin and see if it works to tag them in the spring, see if we can detect when they depart the Fraser Estuary to head north towards their breeding grounds up in the Arctic. And we're also hoping we might get some detections on new Modus stations that are going up along the Strait of Georgia. So Environment Canada, as well as being busy installing new stations at Colony Farm, they're also installing a number of stations along the Strait of Georgia. And these 2 stations in Nanaimo and Sechelt have just gone up within the last month, and a few more are going to go up further north along the coast of Vancouver Island later this month. So that could be really interesting to see if we pick up any birds moving north as they head out on their spring migration. There's also potential that some collaborators may put up a few new towers even further north in Alaska and Haida Gwaii. So that would be really exciting to see what animals end up getting detected on those stations if they get installed. So at the heart of Modus is collaboration, and the work we're doing at Birds Canada is really only a small part of the picture. There's a regional collaboration group for Western North America and South America that we're a part of, which is the Partners in Flight Western Working Group Modus Initiative. And the area of interest is the whole Pacific Flyway. So you can see we've got a very ambitious amount of ground to cover. And there were almost no stations in 2017 in Western North and South America. Except for there were a few in southern BC even then. But today we've got a whole lot more, quite a few more in BC, as well as several more in the States, and more coming up along the western coast of South America as well. And in the next couple of years, we hope to get a number more stations installed in the Western and the Pacific Flyway and Western North and South America. A number of stations are going up in northwestern Mexico actually right now for another shorebird project. So that'll be really interesting to see if birds that they tag get detected on these stations in BC as they move north, and any birds that get tagged in BC might get detected on their stations as they move south. So it's really exciting to see how the network is expanding, and folks have been doing a great job of collaborating and organizing to expand the network in a strategic and coordinated fashion. And at its heart, Modus is community science. It's a global network of researchers and volunteers that all are working together to make this whole system function. We're hoping it provides robust and fine-scale information that's applicable and accessible and at a relatively affordable rate for tracking technology. And ultimately, we hope that it provides opportunities for education. A number of schools have Modus stations installed, and that provides a really neat opportunity for students to get to know the birds that are passing through their areas and have a connection to them. And then also, we hope that it's providing relevant information for conservation, and that ultimately it becomes greater than the sum of its parts. So with that, I'd like to thank the many people who have been very instrumental in this project and Modus broadly, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you have.